The HOA board thought they were about to crush my disabled grandson, Lucas, in court, silencing him with legal fees and technicalities. They smirked, convinced he had no chance of fighting back. After all, he was just a 19-year-old kid grieving the recent tragic loss of his parents, struggling to hold on to the home they left him. And that's exactly what the HOA wanted. They had been waiting for this moment, waiting for his parents to be out of the way so they could prey on the one person they thought couldn't fight back. They had no compassion, no mercy. They saw an easy target, a defenseless boy they could bully into submission. They were bent on stealing his property, confident that he lacked the means to fight back. But what they didn't know, the boy they mocked was about to dismantle their entire case. Piece by piece, they walked into court expecting a weak, clueless kid. They walked out realizing they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. I'm his grandfather, and here is what happened. The tension inside the courtroom was almost unbearable, thick like a storm cloud ready to burst. Every seat in the gallery was filled, occupied by curious onlookers whispering among themselves, their voices a low hum of speculation. Some leaned forward, eager to witness the spectacle unfold. Others sat back, shaking their heads, convinced they already knew how this was going to end. Rows of HOA board members sat smugly in the gallery, their well-dressed attorneys exchanging knowing glances, already celebrating a victory they hadn't yet won. They thought today would be simple, quick ruling. At the center of it all stood my grandson, Lucas, a young, disabled boy, alone and without resources, standing against a powerful homeowners association that had been ruthless in its pursuit of his family's home. They had no idea what was coming. The heavy wooden defendant's table seemed almost comically large compared to his lean frame. He stood beside it, his crutches resting against the edge, untouched. Though he could have used them for support, he chose not to, a silent statement that he would not be seen as weak today. His posture was slightly hunched, the weight of grief still clinging to him. Just months ago, his world had shattered. His parents, his anchors, his protectors, were gone in an instant, ripped away by a senseless accident that never should have happened. One rainy evening, they had been driving home from a family dinner, a rare night where laughter had filled the car, where his mom had playfully scolded his dad for missing a turn, where Lucas had felt safe, whole. But then, blinding headlights, the deafening screech of brakes, the violent crunch of metal, a reckless driver, speeding through an intersection, took them both. Lucas had survived, but just barely. The crash had left him with injuries that would forever remind him of that night. His body healed, but the scars of that moment, of hearing the doctors say, "There was nothing we could do," would never fade. Now, the home his parents had fought so hard for, the place filled with their memories, was all he had left of them. And the HOA wanted to take that too. Their tactics were cruel, as cold as they were calculated. The HOA had moved the fence line, encroaching on Lucas's property inch by inch, as if he wouldn't notice. They slapped him with fraudulent violations. A chipped paint fine here, an unauthorized wheelchair ramp there. The infractions were fabricated, the fees outrageous. They assumed he wouldn't have the money to fight back. Court cases were expensive, and their lawyers were among the best money could buy. They banked on intimidation and financial exhaustion. But it wasn't just about harassment. No, they had a bigger plan. The HOA knew exactly what they were doing. They were burying Lucas in debt, slapping him with unpayable fines, racking up legal fees he couldn't afford. They weren't just trying to intimidate him. They were setting him up for financial ruin. Because once he couldn't pay, they would strike. A lien here, a missed payment there. Then they'd rip the house from under him, selling it off to one of their own at a fraction of its worth. A grieving orphan thrown onto the street, while they profited from his loss. It was cruel. It was calculated. And they thought it was inevitable. They weren't after petty fines. They wanted Lucas home. And they were convinced that, in time, he would have no choice but to surrender it. One of the HOA representatives had even chuckled at Lucas before the hearing. "Listen, Lucas, this is just business. You don't have the money and we do. You're going to lose. So why drag it out?" Lucas hadn't responded. He just memorized the smug expression on the man's face. He'd wipe it off soon enough. They had made one fatal mistake. They underestimated Lucas. The HOA board, seated across the room, didn't bother hiding their smirks. To them, Lucas was just a scared, disabled kid in over his head. What was even more painful, the deception from Lucas's parents' friends who were in the HOA board and neighborhood. After his parents were gone, these friends in the HOA, once warm, once supportive, had faded into the background. Lucas had once believed in those people. They had attended his parents' funeral, hugged him with tears in their eyes, whispered empty promises of support. But when the HOA came for him, those same people turned their backs. None of them stood up for him. None of them even warned him of what was coming. He wasn't just fighting the HOA. He was fighting a neighborhood that had already decided he had lost. Some neighbors whispered their sympathies, offered sad smiles, even left casseroles on his doorstep. But sympathy wasn't enough. Lucas had spent sleepless nights staring at the front door, hoping, just once, that one of them would knock, that one of them would say, "You don't have to do this alone." But no one ever came. Not a single one of them spoke up. Not a single one of them fought for him. Because in this neighborhood, kindness was silent, but fear was loud. In this neighborhood, the HOA always won. Until today, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Let us know where you're watching from today, and if you're new here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to join our growing community. The lead attorney for the HOA, Garrett Caldwell, sat back in his seat, exuding an air of overconfidence as he adjusted his expensive, tailored suit. His smug smirk hadn't faded since the moment he walked into the courtroom. To him, this wasn't a case, it was a formality, a performance where he already knew the ending. He wasn't alone in his arrogance. The other HOA lawyers chuckled quietly among themselves. Exchanging glances like this was all a joke. The board members sat with folded arms, their expressions dripping with amusement. They were already celebrating. This wasn't a trial to them. It was a spectacle. One where they expected Lucas to fumble, panic, and ultimately lose everything. Garrett finally leaned forward, his fingers lazily tapping against the polished oak table. His sharp gaze swept over Lucas, his lips curling into something between a smirk and a sneer. "So, let me get this straight," Garrett drawled, his voice carrying the same dry amusement one might use when scolding a child for speaking out of turn. "You actually think you can argue this case? On your own?" A few chuckles rippled through the HOA's side of the courtroom. Their lawyers smirked, the board members shook their heads, and even the HOA's secretary, seated in the gallery, covered her mouth to stifle a laugh. Lucas didn't say a word. He didn't react to the snide remarks, the quiet laughter, the sheer disrespect dripping from every corner of the room. They thought this was funny. They had no idea who they were dealing with. He just sat there, still, silent, watching, waiting. Then Garrett sighed dramatically, flipping through his neatly organized case file with the casual arrogance of a man who had already won. "Your Honor," he began, dragging out the words as if even speaking them was a waste of time. "Let's not waste the court's valuable time here. We all know how this ends. Mr. Dawson is in blatant violation of HOA rules, and there is no legal precedent that can save him." He paused for effect, casting a quick glance toward Lucas, as if waiting for him to shrink under the weight of his words. When Lucas didn't react, Garrett's smirk deepened. "Your Honor," he continued, his voice taking on a feigned air of professionalism. "This case is simple. The defendant, Mr. Dawson, has repeatedly violated HOA regulations. And these aren't minor infractions. These are direct, documented violations that threaten the integrity of our community's property values." He flicked his wrist, picking up a thick stack of papers before dropping them dramatically onto the table. "First and foremost, he has repeatedly ignored notices to correct unapproved modifications to his property," Garrett continued, his tone condescending. "Despite clear HOA guidelines, Mr. Dawson constructed an unauthorized wheelchair ramp, which, while unfortunate, violates aesthetic standards outlined in our neighborhood's covenant." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Lucas's jaw clenched, but he didn't react. Garrett wasn't done. There's also the matter of the fence, he went on, flipping a page. Mr. Dawson has refused to comply with property line adjustments outlined by the HOA's community mapping. Lucas knew exactly what that meant. They had moved the property line, stealing inches of his land and claiming it as theirs. And now, they were accusing him of violating it. The defendant has been issued multiple warnings, Garrett added smoothly. His fines have gone unpaid. The HOA, in good faith, has tried to work with him, but he refuses to comply. Then came the final blow, which brings us to the matter of trespassing. Lucas lifted his head. The defendant was caught accessing property that was no longer his, according to HOA boundary adjustments. The HOA's investigator personally witnessed him violating the property line before issuing fines and penalties. This alone is enough to warrant a violation. Garrett turned toward the jury, shaking his head with mock disappointment. Your Honor, this case isn't just about rules. This is about a homeowner who refuses to respect the very guidelines that keep our neighborhood safe, clean, and desirable. The HOA has given him every opportunity to resolve these issues peacefully, and instead, through his non-compliance with our demands, he has chosen to let this into a legal circus. Frankly, Your Honor, Garrett continued, this isn't even worth a lengthy trial. The evidence speaks for itself. This young man is desperately trying to hold onto something that no longer belongs to him. Another murmur of agreement from the HOA's table. One of the board members audibly scoffed. Lucas simply watched. Garrett leaned back, completely at ease. He had already won. Lucas was just a formality, a loose end to be tied up. The problem with men like Garrett? They never saw the storm coming until it was already overhead. Lucas had spent months preparing for this. Not for this exact moment. He never planned to stand here alone, fighting for his home, defending himself against people who once pretended to care. But he had studied everything. While other kids memorized football stats, Lucas memorized property law. While his peers played video games, sinking hours into fantasy battles and high scores, Lucas played out mock trials in his mind, crafting arguments, dismantling imaginary cases, preparing for battles that no one ever thought he would have to fight. While other kids spent summers at the beach, Lucas spent his in legal libraries. He would sit beside his father, listening as he dissected rulings, debated legal theories, and exposed the cracks in ironclad cases. Most kids wanted to be astronauts or athletes. Lucas, he wanted to understand the rules that controlled the world. While his former neighbors ignored him, he dissected every case the HOA had ever won. They thought he was just a kid grasping at straws. They were about to realize just how wrong they were. Lucas's father, my son, Franklin Dawson, had worked as a paralegal for over 2 decades. He wasn't a lawyer, but she might as well have been. He had seen how the system worked and how it failed. He had spent years inside courtrooms, watching attorneys fumble cases, cut corners, and sell out their clients for quick settlements. He had seen how prosecutors twisted evidence, how judges had their favorites, how defense attorneys sometimes barely put up a fight. Lucas absorbed everything. As a child, he would sit at the dinner table, listening to his father vent to his mom after a long day. The firm took another plea deal today. The defendant didn't even know he had better options. That prosecutor? He knows how to manipulate a jury, uses emotion over facts every time. Some attorneys don't even read half the cases they take on. They just assume they'll settle before trial. Most kids tuned out when their parents talked about work. Lucas studied every word. As a result, by the time Lucas was 10 years old, he could break down a court case better than most first-year law students. His brain worked differently. When he watched courtroom dramas, he didn't just enjoy the story. He paused the screen, rewound testimony, and picked apart every flaw in the argument with his father. When he saw an injustice, he didn't just get angry, he dissected it. He researched, looking up statutes and precedents, figuring out how it could have been fought and won. Every question, every strategy, every argument, his father was there, pushing him to think deeper. "Don't just tell me it's unfair," his father would say. "Tell me how you'd fight it, and tell me how you'd win." His father used to tell him, "You'd make a great attorney one day," While his classmates worried about high school exams, Lucas was reading real court transcripts. He was never supposed to use this knowledge for himself. He had never imagined that his first case would be his own, and that his opponent would be a corrupt HOA and a smug, overconfident attorney who thought they had already won. Sitting in the courtroom, Judge Malcolm Reeves remained neutral, his expression unreadable. He wasn't laughing. Unlike the HOA's legal team, he wasn't here to make a spectacle out of Lucas's suffering. He tapped a finger against his bench, waiting for the HOA's attorney to wrap up his monologue. "Are you finished, Mr. Caldwell?" the judge asked, his tone even. Garrett gave an exaggerated nod, closing his case file with a satisfied snap. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe the facts speak for themselves. Frankly, I'd rather not spend my entire afternoon on this. I have a golf game at 2. A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom, mostly from the HOA's side. Garrett smirked at the reaction, leaning back in his chair, completely at ease. To him, this wasn't a real case. It was a formality, a waste of time. Judge Malcolm Reeves lifted an eyebrow at the remark, his expression unreadable. He didn't comment. He simply flipped open the case file in front of him, leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. His expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker of something. Mild surprise, perhaps, before he spoke. "Mr. Dawson," he said, "your lawyer." Lucas lifted his chin slightly. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." A ripple of amusement spread through the courtroom. The lead HOA attorney, Garrett Caldwell, smirked. "Representing yourself?" Garrett let out a low, amused chuckle, shaking his head. "Oh, this is going to be fun." Another HOA lawyer shook his head in mock disbelief, letting out a dramatic sigh. "Kid, this isn't some school debate tournament. This is real court, real law. You sure you don't want to save yourself the embarrassment?" Lucas didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't react. He was used to being underestimated. He had spent his childhood navigating a world that saw his disability before his intellect. He had learned patience, had mastered the art of watching and waiting. His late father, a paralegal, had often told him, "The law isn't about who has the most money. It's about who knows how to use it." And Lucas knew. The judge gave a small nod. "Very well. Proceed." His voice was steady, but for the first time, there was a pause, like a brief hesitation, as if even he sensed that something was about to change. No one in the courtroom was laughing when Lucas took his first step forward. The smug smiles, the quiet chuckles, the dismissive glances, they all disappeared, because for the first time they all really saw him. Lucas gripped his crutches and moved with slow, deliberate precision, each step calculated. Not because he wanted to draw attention to himself, but because he had no choice. The soft metallic click of the crutch tips against the polished courtroom floor echoed in the silence. A sound that had followed him all his life. A sound that reminded him of every hallway in school where other kids rushed past while he struggled to keep up. A sound that reminded him of every time he was left behind on field trips because no one wanted to wait for him. A sound that reminded him of standing in the rain outside his house after his parents' funeral, gripping those same crutches, listening to well-meaning neighbors murmur, "Poor boy. What's he going to do now?" And now here he was, standing in a courtroom, facing people who wanted to take away the last thing his parents left him. My wife and I sat in the gallery, our hands clenched together, holding onto each other for strength. We had raised our own children. We had seen hardships, lived through struggles, but nothing prepared us for the weight of watching our grandson fight a battle he should never have had to face. We weren't alone either. Aunties, uncles, family, friends, we were all there. We had come not just to watch, but to bear witness. To show the HOA, their smug lawyers, and anyone else who dared to doubt him that Lucas Dawson was not alone. But as much as we wanted to fight for him, we knew this was his moment. Lucas adjusted his stance, his hands tightening around the grips of his crutches. His posture remained straight, his expression unreadable, but the weight of everything was there. The exhaustion, the grief, the quiet defiance. He let the silence stretch just a little too long. Long enough that the amusement in the room turned into discomfort. long enough that someone in the gallery shifted in their seat, clearing their throat, suddenly aware of how quiet it had become. And then, finally, he spoke. "Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to clarify something with the prosecution." Garrett Caldwell, still lounging in his chair, let out an exaggerated sigh. "By all means," he said, folding his arms, his tone dripping with mock patience. Lucas nodded, his expression unreadable. Lucas met Garrett's gaze without hesitation. "Mr. Caldwell, just to confirm, your case relies on the claim that the HOA's investigator personally witnessed me violating the property line before issuing fines and penalties. Is that correct?" Garrett scoffed, barely concealing his boredom. "That's right," he said dismissively. Lucas tilted his head slightly, as if weighing his next words carefully. "And that claim is documented in the official HOA report, correct?" Garrett rolled his eyes, already losing patience. "Obviously, it's all in the written report, clear as day." Lucas didn't react. Instead, he shifted his focus to Judge Malcolm Reeves. His voice didn't waver. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence." And just like that, the air in the courtroom changed. Judge Malcolm Reeves squinted at Lucas, his brow furrowing slightly. "On what grounds?" The room was still, the weight of the moment pressing against the silence. For the first time since stepping forward, Lucas pulled his hands from his pockets. He adjusted his grip on his crutches before gesturing toward Garrett Caldwell's table, his movements deliberate. Then, with a voice steady and unwavering, he dropped the first bombshell. "Because the HOA's investigator never actually saw me violating the property line. In fact, he wasn't even present when the alleged infraction occurred." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Garrett's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second. Just enough for Lucas to catch it. But Lucas wasn't done. He had spent weeks preparing for this. Late nights combing through surveillance footage, property reports, and timestamps. Hours reading and rereading the HOA's own documents, searching for weaknesses in their case. And now, he had found the first crack. The prosecution's entire argument hinged on the investigator's direct observation. Without it, their case was no longer solid, it was crumbling. Lucas straightened his posture, eyes locked on Garrett. Let's see how he tries to talk his way out of this. For the first time since the trial began, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Garrett Caldwell's face. It was small, barely there, but Lucas caught it. Garrett had walked into this courtroom certain of an easy win, too sure of himself, too confident in his airtight case. But now something wasn't adding up, and it showed. Lucas took another slow step forward, his movements deliberate, his crutches pressing against the polished floor with a steady rhythm. He wasn't just fighting for his home. He was dismantling their lies, brick by brick. "Your Honor," he said, his voice clear and firm, "if the court allows, I'd like to submit more evidence contradicting the HOA's claims." Judge Reeves raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Lucas walked to the evidence table with a calm, measured step. "First, let's discuss the alleged fence line violation. The HOA moved my property boundary, claiming encroachment. However, he placed a document on the table. This is an independent land survey I commissioned, proving the original boundary. The HOA's change was fraudulent." Caldwell's smirk faltered slightly. "That's irrelevant." Lucas cut him off. "Second," he continued, "I'd like to enter into evidence a copy of my parents' original HOA contract." He placed another document down. "Nowhere in this contract does it state that property lines can be adjusted without homeowner consent." He turned to the judge. "Which means the HOA's actions were illegal." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Lucas wasn't done. "Furthermore," he continued, his voice unwavering, "the HOA fined me for violations that were never cited before my parents' passing. In fact," he tapped a new document. "This is an internal HOA email obtained legally stating, and I quote, 'The Dawson boy can't fight this. He doesn't have the money. Keep the pressure on until he sells.'" The courtroom fell silent. Garrett's face drained of color. "Objection. That email was..." Lucas turned, eyes sharp. Was what? Evidence of harassment? Fraud? Malicious intent? At the HOA's table, the board members weren't smirking anymore. The once confident president of the HOA, Mr. Holloway, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. Beside him, Mrs. Langford, the treasurer, hastily flipped through documents, as if searching for something, anything, to save them. But there was nothing left. Everything was crumbling in real time. One of the board members, a nervous-looking man in a too-tight suit, leaned toward Garrett, whispering harshly. "Fix this," he hissed, his voice barely audible. This wasn't supposed to happen, but Garrett didn't move, didn't speak, because he knew as well as they did, there was no fixing this. Lucas had ripped their case apart, exposed their lies, their greed, their corruption. And now, everyone in that courtroom was watching them drown. Judge Malcolm Reeves took the document, his expression unreadable as his eyes moved over the contents. Then he read it again, slower this time. The change was subtle at first, the way his fingers tightened around the edges of the paper, the way his jaw set just a little firmer. Then his gaze lifted, sharp, piercing, and landed directly on Garrett Caldwell. "Mr. Caldwell," the judge's voice was no longer neutral, carried a weight, a warning. "Are you prepared to dispute the authenticity of this email?" A silence stretched across the room, heavy, expectant. Garrett didn't answer immediately, and that was his biggest mistake. The judge exhaled sharply, setting the document down with a deliberate motion. He wasn't just holding a piece of paper, he was holding evidence of something much bigger. He tapped his fingers against the bench, his next words coming slower, more pointed. "Because if this email is real, then this entire case is built on deception. Which means," his gaze darkened, "someone has a lot to answer for." The murmur in the gallery swelled. One of the jurors shifted in their seat, whispering to the person beside them. Lucas remained silent, because this was no longer just a case about HOA violations. This was about fraud, corruption, an entire scheme designed to steal from a grieving young man. And now, the judge saw it too. Lucas exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle. "Your Honor, I move for immediate dismissal of all HOA claims. Their case is built on fraudulent evidence and unethical tactics." Judge Reeves studied the evidence for a long moment. Then, slowly he exhaled, shaking his head just slightly, like a man realizing he had almost let something terrible slip through the cracks. Judge Malcolm Reeves tapped his fingers on his desk, deep in thought. Finally, he turned to Garrett. "Do you have anything to refute this?" Garrett hesitated too long again. One of the HOA board members, sweat beading at his temple, turned to Garrett in a panic. "We have to settle," he hissed under his breath. "This is falling apart." Mr. Holloway, the HOA president, ran a hand down his face, his voice low and panicked. "We're done. We're so done." But it was too late. The damage was done. "Motion granted," the judge declared. "Case dismissed." Garrett Caldwell's face was pale now, his usual cocky demeanor completely stripped away. But men like him didn't go down without a fight. He shot up from his chair, grasping at one last thread of control. "Objection, Your Honor." His voice cracked slightly, but he recovered quickly, straightening his tie as if he still had a grip on the situation. "This is irrelevant speculation. The defendant is twisting facts to mislead the court." Judge Malcolm Reeves slowly turned to look at him, unamused. A long pause, then a single sharp tap of the judge's gavel. "Overruled." That one word sealed it. Garrett's shoulders tensed, his mouth opening as if he wanted to argue, but nothing came out, because there was nothing left to say. Judge Reeves folded his hands and leveled Garrett with a piercing stare. "Mr. Caldwell, this court does not tolerate deception. Not from attorneys, and certainly not from those who claim to uphold community standards." He let the words settle before delivering the final blow. "I suggest you and your clients prepare yourselves. If this email is real, there will be consequences beyond this courtroom." A stunned silence filled the room. Then, chaos, whispers, reporters scribbling notes, the HOA board members fuming as they realized they had just been outmaneuvered by a teenager they had mocked. Lucas sat still for a moment, absorbing the victory, his heart hammering in his chest. Then he looked up to meet the eyes of Garrett. The man looked pale, rattled, his earlier arrogance completely gone. Lucas gave him the smallest nod, calm, collected, victorious. I had never been more proud in my life. For months, I had watched my grandson carry a burden no 19-year-old should ever have to bear. I had watched him stand alone, fight alone, and be underestimated at every turn. I had watched those smug HOA board members mock him, dismiss him, try to break him. But Lucas, he never wavered. And now, as the judge delivered his final ruling, as Garrett Caldwell's face fell and the courtroom sat in stunned silence, I realized something. My grandson had won. The moment the gavel struck, my wife, Margaret, let out a shaky breath beside me. She had been holding it for far too long. Her hands trembled in her lap, her knuckles white from how tightly she had clutched them together. She turned to me, eyes brimming with tears, but these weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief, of pride, of justice. I felt a lump rise in my throat as I looked at my grandson. My boy, standing there, shoulders squared, head held high, victorious. I had known Lucas was smart. I had known he was strong. But today he was unstoppable. The courtroom buzzed with hushed murmurs, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. The HOA board members were in disarray. Whispers, frantic gestures, the unmistakable look of people who knew they had just lost everything. But Lucas, he didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He just stood there, calm, steady, like he had known this outcome all along. And then, for the first time, he turned to look at us. Margaret didn't hesitate. She was already out of her seat, rushing toward him before he could take another step. She threw her arms around him, clutching him like she had when he was a boy, before life had taken so much from him. "You did it, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You did it." I rose to my feet, my old bones aching from the weight of years, but I didn't care. I placed a firm hand on his shoulder, squeezing it tightly. I had never been a man of many words, but in that moment, I only needed one. "Your father would be proud, Lucas." He stilled. For the first time, I saw the emotion break through his carefully built composure. His eyes glistened just slightly, his throat bobbing as he swallowed down whatever words had tried to form. And then he nodded. No words were needed, because in that moment he knew. He had fought, he had won, and he had made his father proud. And as I looked at my grandson, not just as the boy I had helped raise, but as a man who had fought for what was right, I realized something else. I had never been prouder. Outside the courthouse, the air buzzed with chaos. Reporters swarmed the steps, their voices a tangled mess of overlapping questions, cameras flashing in rapid bursts. Microphones jutted toward Lucas like weapons, each reporter desperate for a soundbite. "Lucas, did you know the judge was going to dismiss the case? What's your next move now that you've won? How does it feel to outmaneuver an experienced legal team?" The questions came fast, loud, relentless. Lucas didn't flinch. He exhaled slowly, then reached up and pulled the hood of his sweatshirt over his head. Not in defeat, not in retreat, but because he had no interest in this circus. This wasn't about the cameras. This wasn't about proving how smart he was. This had never been about winning for the sake of winning. It had always been about something bigger. Lucas had fought for his home, his future, the legacy his parents had left behind. And now, as he stepped past the flashing lights, ignoring the shouted questions, he realized something. This battle was over. But the war was just beginning. The cameras kept flashing, the voices of reporters still shouting for a response. But Lucas wasn't paying attention anymore. This chapter was over. Across the street, standing beside his car, Judge Malcolm Reeves watched. His posture was different now, no longer the detached authority of a man passing judgment. Instead, something else flickered in his expression. Recognition, not just of Lucas's resilience, but of his undeniable talent. Lucas met his gaze for a brief moment. Then, without a word, he turned toward me and his grandmother. She reached out, gently supporting him as he made his way toward our car. That's when I noticed it. Judge Reeves had left his car too. At first, it seemed like he was headed toward the courthouse doors. But then, he veered slightly, walking directly toward us. And just as we reached the car, his voice cut through the air. "Mr. Dawson." Lucas stopped. A pause. Then Judge Reeves spoke again, his tone different this time. Not dismissive, not authoritative, but sincere. "You should consider law school." For a brief second, Lucas smiled. A small, knowing smile. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. Lucas paused, then finally spoke. "I don't just want to study law, Your Honor. I want to change it." Lucas had won. But as he sat in the car, the courthouse fading behind him, his victory didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of something much bigger. He had had the knowledge to fight back. But what about the ones who didn't? How many others had been bullied by powerful organizations, buried under paperwork, suffocated by legal fees, and forced to give up what was rightfully theirs simply because they didn't know how to fight? This case had never been about ego. It had never been about proving he was smarter than them. It had been about justice. And if there was one thing Lucas knew now, it was that this courtroom wouldn't be the last one he stood in. But next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the attorney. And when that day came, he wouldn't be the only one. Because the system wasn't broken, it was rigged. And Lucas Dawson was about to do something about it. If this story made you think, even for a second, then share it. Because standing up for what's right starts with awareness. If you believe in justice, in standing up for what's right and want to continue to see more stories like this, make sure you like and subscribe to our channel. Every day, we share captivating Karen HOA stories you won't want to miss. Your support means the world to us. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in our next video.